Hello, everybody. Ted Huntington here with another book reading. Today I'm going to read Golden Circle by my friend Terry Heflin. This is Chapter 7 of Golden Circle by Terry Heflin. A little background before we get started with Chapter 7. We are in Crutchfield House. This is a hotel in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Rebecca and Robert are now married, and an operative from the Department of the Treasury has just arrived with instructions. Chapter 7 of Golden Circle. Burnt orange fingers of the setting sun pointed heavenward toward the clouds, over Lookout Mountain to the northwest of Chattanooga, creating silver linings. Robert stood in his shirt sleeves when he answered the rap at the door. A young man, no older than 25, stood in the door frame, eyes caught on Robert's pistol in his shoulder holster. "Ken Reese, Major Harper. You should be expecting me. Good evening." Robert swung the door wide, stuck out his hand. "Glad to meet you, Reese. May I present my wife?" Reese's handshake was firm as he stepped into the room, removed his hat, smiled, and nodded at Rebecca. "Mrs. Harper, good evening." "Evening, Mr. Reese." The young man's eyes grinned, and he looked at his fingers as they played with the brim of his hat. "Please, ma'am, just call me Ken." Robert picked up the slat-back chair by the top rail and placed it in front of the overstuffed chair by the window, where Rebecca watched their visitor carefully. Robert lifted his tumbler in greeting. "Brandy, or would you prefer coffee?" Reese scanned the room and noted the table in a corner where an ornate crystal carafe, half filled with a clear bronze liquor, was placed, an empty glass next to it. "Brandy would be fine, thank you, sir." Robert motioned for the young man to sit as he poured a tumbler and handed it over. He smiled, then seated himself on the thick arm of the leather chair next to Rebecca. "Let us dispense with formalities. No need to address me as sir, not in uniform at the moment." Robert observed him in the instant of silence. "You have information?" Reese slung his hat on the back of the chair, smiled, and raised his glass to Robert. He enjoyed a long sip, stifled a cough, set the glass on the table, and reached into his short waistcoat's left pocket and withdrew several folded papers. "First, ma'am, let me express the condolences of the Department of the Treasury and its agents on the death of Mrs. Stewart." "Your sentiments are greatly appreciated." Rebecca moved her hand on her lap. Reese noticed the black leather wallet that held the narrow bundle of papers, which had been removed earlier from Rose's leather traveling case. Reese arched an eyebrow. "I gather those are Mrs. Stewart's traveling instructions to Ohio? You have read them?" "We have." Robert sipped his drink. "According to the papers, Rose was to travel to Cincinnati to make contact with one of our agents, a Sidney Marshall, already inserted at the KGC, and who was a high-ranking Copperhead politician. Are you at liberty to disclose why she was to do this?" Rebecca blinked. "Rose mentioned the name of Stanton before she died." "If I could address one point at a time," Reese cut in, cleared his throat, and unfolded the papers before he turned his gaze on Rebecca. She glanced up at Robert. He sat pensively on the arm of the chair, but shifted his glass from one hand to the other and placed a free hand on her wrist. Reese passed the top sheet of his papers to Robert, who scanned it. "To state the orders bluntly, ma'am, you will remain in Memphis and ingratiate yourself into the KGC in that city while your husband continues west to Arkansas." Robert handed the sheet to Rebecca. Reese paused to give Rebecca a moment to peruse the document. His eyes shifted between them as his voice retained its matter-of-fact tone. "Both of you will travel tomorrow morning to Memphis. Once you depart the train at the depot on Calhoun Avenue, Mrs. Harper will take a carriage to the Double Diamond on South Front Street. Ms. Lily Mulvaney is the proprietor." Robert looked up sharply. Lily Mulvaney, tall, strawberry blonde, rather shapely, striking blue eyes with flecks of hazel. "Singer?" Rebecca looked askance at him and frowned. You know the lady? If it is the same woman, yes, we have been acquainted. Robert smirked, sipped his brandy, and was met with Rebecca's own emerald eyes that flashed at his unspoken meaning. Reese watched the interchange. Matches her description, heard she heralds from the northeast. The room became awkwardly quiet as Reese leaned forward and picked up his glass of brandy, took a hasty sip, and replaced the glass on the table. Rebecca shifted in her chair and focused back on Ken Reese. The northeast, you say? Yes, ma'am. Thought. I am not sure, though. It is. My husband is originally from the northeast, Rebecca interrupted as her eyes darted again to Robert. Yes, well, please continue, Ken. Yes, ma'am. Ms. Mulvaney has been made aware of your impending arrival. You will reside on the premises. I understand you are a most accomplished pianist. Reese's complimentary tone attempted to lighten the tension in the room. She is working for the department, and why is my talent with the piano of interest? Robert awkwardly shifted on his feet. Ms. Mulvaney is very valuable and most adept at getting men to talk. Robert raised his eyebrows at Reese's declaration. But let me assure you, Mrs. Harper, Reese hurriedly added, there is no need for you to worry about your reputation. Your presence at the Double Diamond is dedicated to musical entertainment. Robert inhaled deeply and stepped to the window, his back to the young man. Reese, let me guess. The Double Diamond is frequented by Knights of the Golden Circle members? As you know, sir, Mr. Harper, Memphis was taken under Union control some time ago. However, the city has remained a hotbed of duplicity and espionage on both sides. Our sources have confirmed that members of the KGC have used the Double Diamond as a popular meeting place. Captain Quantrill and Bloody Bill Anderson have snuck into the city and met there frequently. Seems Quantrill is quite enamored with Ms. Mulvaney. Memphis may be under Union control, but it still has strong, valiant ties to the Confederacy. Reese pulled 2 train tickets and a boxcar voucher for the horses from the papers and handed them to Rebecca. Mrs. Stewart was to give these to you upon her return from our meeting. The trip to Memphis will not be as comfortable as the trip from Marietta to Chattanooga, some 250 miles. There are several water stops. At the wood stops, you will find a cafe for a meal and a time to pasearse. Rebecca grinned. A walkabout will be a welcome relief. Robert returned from the window and took the tickets from her outstretched hand. He walked across the room and placed them on the dresser. Together, you will take the Memphis to Charleston train. It leaves around noon, if it is on schedule. Reese drained his glass, coughed lightly as the liquid warmed his throat. Once you are in Memphis, Mrs. Harper, you are to take the last name of Stewart to carry on the ruse you began in Georgia. Rebecca nodded. I am glad now that my scarlet gown has been packed. She winked at Robert as he strode to the side table and refilled his glass. Reese reached into his coat once again and pulled out a thin black book. He flipped through the pages and then passed it to her. One more item to give to you, Mrs. Harper. This is a code book, not the kind you used in Richmond. Rebecca raised her eyebrows. Oh, yes, ma'am. Mr. Fessenden notified me of your history with your cousin Elise and her circle of ladies in the Confederate capital. Reese pointed at the book in her hand. This code book is the same one used by the Wells Fargo Company to intercept evidence about robberies and forgeries. No symbols. The codes are words and phrases that will make up messages you will use to contact your husband and to inform Mr. Fessenden about what duplicities you are certain to become privy to at the Double Diamond. You said that I will use the codes to contact my husband? She glanced at Robert. So I gather he will not be close by in the city. Reese shook his head and turned his attention to Robert. You, sir, will board the Memphis to Little Rock train, ride to the end of the line, and then travel overland to Murfreesboro, Arkansas. You will be given detailed instructions as to your role and purpose when you reach Memphis. I assume you have the Reb uniform in one of those carpet bags there? Ah, Fessenden never reveals too much all at once. Robert's eyes glinted. Yes, all neatly pressed and packed. Robert knocked back his drink. Does Lily know Rebecca is my wife? At his use of the woman's first name, Rebecca narrowed her eyes. No, Fessenden indicated he wanted this information kept secret. For your protection, ma'am, but there is always the element of discovery and danger. Ms. Mulvaney only knows to expect you sometime in the next day or so. Mr. Reese, Ken, you have talked about where we are to go and what I am to do when we leave Chattanooga. But what about my second question concerning the name of Stanton? Is this President Lincoln's Secretary of War? And why was his name the last word Rose uttered to me before she died? Robert noticed the imploring glance Reese gave to his empty glass. He plucked it from the table, refilled it, and handed back. Much appreciated. He nodded, took a long first sip, then lowered the glass in his hands to his lap. Rather complicated. It is well known that Secretary Stanton rarely leaves the war room in Washington, D.C. However, Stanton has made plans to travel to Ohio to the Eagle Iron Works in Cincinnati to meet with Miles Greenwood concerning further development of the Cincinnati breech cannon for the Ordnance Department. He paused and swirled the liquor slowly in the glass. In addition to his inspections at munitions factories, it is also an election year. Secretary Stanton's private train will be making several scheduled stops in the Miami Valley to campaign for Mr. Lincoln. I have heard repeated stories of how the president gets under Stanton's skin, quipped Robert. The young man's face broadened into a wide grin. Shoulders shook in a silent laugh. Yes, he has no patience for the countless homespun stories President Lincoln likes to tell, but both men hold their confidences dearly. Reese shifted in the straight chair and stretched his long legs out in front of him. Shadows of early evening had further dimmed the room since Reese's arrival. Robert ambled to the table by the bed and turned up the flame in the porcelain lamp so that their faces were bathed in a warm glow, and then moved behind Rebecca, where he leaned his elbows on the back of the chair. Rebecca bit her lower lip. This campaign trail trip of Stanton's is why Rose was traveling to Ohio? Correct, ma'am. It is also a gathering place of the Copperheads who wish to see Mr. Lincoln's re-election fail. The KGC has a stronghold in Cincinnati as well as the offshoot of the organization, the Sons of Liberty, led by Clement Vallandigham. Reese nodded at Robert, lowered his voice, and stared at him, a wily agitator. There are rumors, sketchy reports, mind you, of an attempt to snatch the secretary during his visit to the city, just like they tried to abduct the president on his way through Baltimore to the first inauguration. Rebecca gasped. Surely Stanton knows about this rumor. Reese nodded. Oh, yes, ma'am, but since reports of the plot cannot yet be confirmed, he refuses to be deterred. The old fool, Robert muttered. Mrs. Stewart's social and political backgrounds in Baltimore and in Atlanta would have allowed her easy access to Vallandigham. She could have moved freely within the Copperhead political circles. Reese raised his glass to his lips, but paused. If the reports pan out, the kidnapping of the secretary, along with the production and distribution of the counterfeit certificates, are to coincide and create maximum unrest and chaos within Lincoln's cabinet and further complicate the war efforts. Reese slung back the final drops of brandy, coughed slightly, and grimaced against the strong heat of the drink. He placed the glass on the table, reached behind him, and plucked his hat from the back of the chair. Mr. Harper, A revelation about myself. Reese pulled the left lapel of his dark jacket open and revealed a circular brass badge pinned onto his gray shirt with Knights of the Golden Circle stamped around an inner ring with the date of organization. I was placed into the ranks of the KGC several months ago. Be traveling with you for the rest of your journey to Murfreesboro and will be your ticket into Quantrill's camp. Rebecca saw Robert's jaw pulse as Reese stood and closed his lapel over the badge. It is late. Much obliged for your hospitality, Mrs. Harper. Reese moved toward the door, Robert at his heels. Reese carefully turned the knob and opened the door only enough to see into the empty hallway. He looked back at Robert, who stood at his shoulder. It would be wise not to recognize each other until we leave Memphis for Little Rock. Robert nodded, raised his arm above Reese, and placed his hand on the edge of the door. Good evening to the both of you. Reese moved into the hall, stopped mid-step, then glanced back with a boyish grin on his face. And just to let you know, I am not as young as I look. Robert chuckled, closed the door, and turned the key. Rebecca pushed herself from the chair and set the thin black code book into the false bottom of Rose's small case. She peered up at Robert as he came next to her. I guess this belongs to me now. Rebecca restored the bottom panel. What did you think of our guest? Revealed more than I expected. He squinted, unhooked his holster, slipped it off, and hung it over the brass bedpost. His voice was soft and reflective as he rolled up his sleeves and began to unbutton his shirt. We will have to wait and see. Wait and see. Nightfall now blanketed the quiet city. The murmur of a mournful harmonica that played a tune in the distance floated through the open window. Rebecca picked up the derringer from the bedside table. This, too. She balanced the gun in her palm, sighed, placed it on the case, and latched it. Robert brushed his hand across the back of her hair. Can you shoot? Rebecca tilted her face to him and batted her eyes. Have you forgotten already? I am a quick study. Robert leaned down, brushed his lips against hers. You are a strong woman, Rebecca Beaumont O'Connell Harper. What you set out to do, you step right out and do it. Damn the consequences. His left hand slipped the pins from her hair, then moved down to cradle her neck, while his right hand reached out, dimmed the light, and dissolved them into the darkness. That's Chapter 7 of Golden Circle. I hope you enjoyed it.